To those joining us, thank you very much for attending or for listening in. Very happy to be moderating this conversation. My name is Gearoid Millar. I'm a professor in Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Aberdeen, and I'm simply here to moderate and ask some questions of the 5 editors of this new volume on decolonizing peace and conflict studies. Anybody in the field will, of course, know that the efforts to decolonize is much called for, rarely achieved, and unfortunately is something that the field has really struggled to do for all kinds of structural reasons to do with academia and practice and funding. But the editors of this journal have clearly, or this volume, have clearly worked extensively to include voices from regions of the world and communities and cultures that are often marginalized from the discussions and the debates, and to provide, in essence, a quite substantial contribution that really does seem to push us significantly down the route in decolonization. So the 5 editors are all joining us, and I will ask 3 questions. Each of them will then have 5 or 6 minutes to respond to those questions, and we will open up at the end. There'll be at least half an hour for your own questions. Now, we'll be using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So if you move your mouse at all, a little button comes up at the bottom, says Q&A. You can enter your questions there. We won't be opening the mic, but I will then hope to ask those questions to the participants once they have each answered these initial 3 questions. So the questions that we decided to frame the conversation around is: 1, what are the possibilities and constraints in calls and claims to decolonize the field of peace and conflict studies? 2, what does it look like to challenge mainstream assumptions and promote broader, more critical analyses of peace and conflict, especially in a historical moment of rising authoritarianism and genocide in Gaza? 3, how would you describe critical and decolonial approaches to peace and conflict studies? Why is this important? And how do these approaches consider or emphasize gender, race, culture, global history, and political economy? So each of the participants is going to answer these questions. We're going to start with Tim Seidel. And Tim, if you want to demute your mic, I will mute myself and you can respond.
All right. Well, thanks, Gearoid. And hey, y'all. My name is Tim Seidel. I use he, him pronouns, and I teach peace building, development, and global studies at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, the traditional lands of Algonquin, Haudenosaunee, and Siouan peoples. And it's great to be with you all, and it's great to be with my colleagues who put a lot of labor and effort into this handbook. Gratitude to you all, and gratitude to ISA for hosting this conversation, and to you, Gearoid, for facilitating. I'd like to share some reflections on the second question in particular. What does it look like to challenge mainstream assumptions and promote broader, more critical analyses of peace and conflict, especially in the historical moment of rising authoritarianism and genocide in Gaza? So last spring, Professor Abdulmalik Simon tweeted this out. This is what he wrote. He said, "We begin every class, Gaza. We begin every meal, Gaza. We begin every meeting, Gaza. We begin every embrace, Gaza. Perhaps the sheer repetition will enable the neurons to cross the synapses of the sclerotic political class," unquote. So Gaza. This is particularly relevant as university people, right? Every college and university in Gaza has been destroyed, and over 18,000 Palestinian students and 780 Palestinian teachers have been killed by Israel. And here in the US, in a moment of rising authoritarianism, academic freedom continues to be under assault on campuses across our country. Academic freedom tied to protection for the most vulnerable. So this ongoing scholasticide and genocidal violence and ethnic cleansing that Israel is perpetrating across occupied Palestine and the growing authoritarianism in my country, in the US, is the context within which we're having this really important conversation on peace and conflict studies. So perhaps one response to this question of challenge and critique is to historicize and to humanize, acknowledging our embeddedness and even relationality as teachers and as scholars. And perhaps one way we can do this, as Professor Simon writes, is to say Gaza. So I want to say a little bit about our handbook. Peace and conflict studies is an interdisciplinary field that explores the actions, assumptions, relationships, processes that lead to conflict, as well as those that may transform violence and create peace. And our handbook aims to purposefully integrate sort of global interdisciplinary body of knowledge and practice, foregrounding these sort of critical and decolonial approaches that give focused attention to matters of gender and race and culture and political economy. Our goal was for readers to question their assumptions and definitions of peace and conflict and how they are applied to different contexts in a way that interrogates sort of the prevailing liberal traditions beyond the local turn in peace and conflict studies. And attention to peace and conflict issues and approaches from a critical or global perspective makes for a more robust analysis that goes beyond these sort of standard typologies of positive or negative peace to include the study of a wider range of violence, structural, cultural, epistemic, including political and economic violence of the state and the market. So our goal is to create space for a range of approaches to conceptualizing. And rather than taking peace as a given, our handbook critically examines how the concept of peace itself comes to be constituted. Further, rather than shying away from conflict as a concept or as a social phenomena or political or economic phenomena, to be resolved or managed, our handbook builds on the idea of conflict as a process with different phases, awareness levels, relational moments, always characterized by particular configurations of power, balances and imbalances. And so there's a call to pay attention to critical themes of knowledge, politics, struggle, and how the production of oppositional knowledges has the potential to articulate alternative imaginaries for political action, struggle, and change. And this is where, to this question, the second question, this is where methodology and practice play big. And the question of methodology is critical for any intellectual project's attention to knowledge production. It's a recognition that our intellectual work is always at the same time, unavoidably, political work, even struggle for someone. So we ask questions like, who benefits from our work as teachers and as scholars? The purpose is not only to better explain the realities that were embedded within these networks and configurations of power and relationality, but to contribute to emancipatory processes of knowledge production that aim to change those conditions. And this approach to knowledge and politics and struggle follows scholars like the late Palestinian scholar Edward Said, who articulated a methodological sensibility and reflexivity that recognized that underlying every interpretation of politics and culture is, quoting Said, is, quote, the choice facing the individual scholar or intellectual, whether to put intellect at the service of power or at the service of criticism, community, dialogue, and moral sense. And it's the sort of methodology and the sensibility that I also hear from historian Robin D.G. Kelley, U.S. historian out at UCLA, where he wrote in an interview in the LA Times a couple of years ago. Professor Kelley puts it this way. He says, quote, it's really important for me to be engaged in these movements to make no pretense about some kind of dispassionate, detached objectivity. I think that we need to practice something that's even better than objectivity, and that is, as you know, critique. Critique, to me, is better than objectivity. Objectivity is a false stance. I'm not neutral. I've never been neutral. I write about struggles in social movements because I actually don't think the world is right and something needs to change, unquote. And so the sort of methodology discussed here is attentive to these contexts that our handbook is trying to highlight. And it's attentive to these contexts that are, again, we're wrapped up in these networks and these configurations of power and relationality. That is to say, knowledge produced in the context of experiences and relationships with people most impacted by rising authoritarianism, most impacted by genocidal violence. So this invitation, right, to an interrogation of the relationality of our own academic labor, the politics of our own knowledge production. And so this is what's moved many of us inside of ISA to take even action at our annual conferences in recent years, calling for ISA as an association to take positions, recognizing our embeddedness in these contexts, and in particular, to call on ISA to take a position to condemn Israel's genocide in Gaza and to consider boycott, divestment, and sanctions as one way to struggle with this question of relationality, right? And conversations and debates on BDS or boycott, divestment, sanctions are especially relevant to an association like ISA that's dedicated to understanding the international, the transnational, global affairs, and especially in a moment of rising authoritarianism and genocide. So given the gravity of the threats to civilian life and the longevity of colonial threats around the world, and in places like Palestine in particular, the implications for academic freedom, how can our work as teachers and as scholars of peace and conflict studies, and how can ISA itself as an academic association be a space where we work together to understand methodology and relationality, recognizing our intimacies and our entanglements in these stories and silences as one way to challenge and critique in this historical moment of rising authoritarianism and genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for focusing on the second question and for that response, powerful response. Zuba, would you like to take a stab at one or all of these questions?
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me. And I want to start by thanking, of course, my co-editors of the handbook. And Cécile, you've been very instrumental in actually not giving up on me. So thank you very much. Let me just clarify something. Are we tackling all of the questions as at a go, or we're going to come back? When you said you were going to give us 5 minutes, what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, the idea was originally five minutes each. And I gave all 3 questions, and you can respond to all 3 questions.
Okay.
But if you want, like Tim did, to focus on one question, that's also
okay.
fine.
Thanks. Okay. So I want to start. Tim, thank you so much for such a powerful presentation. But I want to focus on the first question, but I will try to walk through the others. So when we speak of peace and conflict studies, we have to also realize that we are engaged in a field that has long been structured by what after Valentin Mudimbe I call the colonial library, which is basically the epistemic and moral scaffolding through which the modern disciplines have codified, sought to represent hierarchized knowledge. And this archive, of course, is a massive collection of knowledge and systems of representation that over centuries have produced non-Western or non-European people, but especially Africa as a paradigm of difference. And as a result, the possibilities then when we start thinking about decolonizing or decolonization or decolonizing peace and conflict studies, therefore lies not in facile inclusion of local voices, because usually this is what is like you get. I remember once I was in a class and somebody was like, "Oh, this class is decolonized." I'm like, "What do you mean? This is now a liberal multicultural politics of inclusivity, or the inclusion of indigenous knowledges, which sometimes also serve as a particular moment of strategic co-option." But to really interrogate the very epistemic condition and possibility and the architecture of the disciplines, their fetishes, the way they construct, even their ideas of what is peace and what is conflict. And also the way in which those places that have been codified by the library are seen as always conflictive, as always pathological, and even not granted the possibility of understanding those particular processes of conflict, for instance, as part of a larger historical, social, or political problem. So the field has long been shaped by liberal and Eurocentric imaginaries that equate peace with order, conflict with disorder, intervention with ethical responsibility, even when it is based on clearly imperialistic vocations. So these imaginaries reproduce the civilizational grammar that we know, through which certain regimes of power, especially the West, continually re-enters non-European and post-colonial spaces as the arbiter and savior. And yet the possibility of decolonizing still passes. So an example, for instance, is that if we take a look, like Tim was referring to Gaza, if we take a look at what is going on in Gaza and in historical Palestine, you won't really be able to understand that necessarily without placing that also within a larger global history that has been formed through continent grabbing, anti-indigenous genocide, colonization. And this is why even those, it's not just an idea of a matter of the politics that links, people will say links Israel, for instance, to the United States. But most of the Western powers actually do support what is going on in Israel. And part of the reason is because Israel is a reflection of their own history, right? So the idea of decolonizing then, it's an imperative, but it is also faced with problems. And part of it really is, how do you decolonize the epistemic structures of disciplines that themselves end up setting the terms in which you enter into conversations about peace, about conflict, if it's international relations, about what is constituted by the international, and so forth. So there is then the double. First, the decolonial project risk, and the point is, when we don't pay attention very seriously to those historical strictures that I'm describing, those processes, but also how the disciplines themselves codify and inform and discipline us in the way in which we enter those spaces. Even when we are critical, or we claim to be critical, it is still the frameworks of the discipline that is framing our responses. Then what happens is that we equate symbolic gestures with decolonization or with radical politics. And so on the one hand, when we think of decolonizing the disciplines, we have to move beyond the multicultural politics of citation, for instance. How many non-Europeans or Western scholars are included in this conversation? We have to go beyond that, because you could still be functioning and actually reproducing the very same Eurocentric perspectives that you are trying to decolonize. I'm not sure if I have exhausted my 5 minutes, but I think I will stop there. And then if I have to come back, then I'll come.
Thank you, Zuba.
Yeah, okay.
Excellent points about I like this notion of the library, right? This kind of library of available narratives and imaginaries that are limiting us. I see Tim's hand up, so I'll give Tim maybe that was an accident. Right, we're moving on. Okay. All right, so Cécile, we've had a very, very robust responses to questions 1 and 2, which of course you may also respond to, but I'd love to see somebody respond to number 3 as well.
Well, thank you very much, Gearoid. And I would like also to thank all my co-editors and also all the contributors to the SAGE handbook, because it has really been a wonderful process. And it has been also a learning journey to work on this handbook. And actually, my reflections really come much from this process that I've gone through while working with all the contributors and my fellow co-editors. So thank you very much. And thank you to ISA and also the universities that co-host the event. So the order we chose actually is the order in which we were lead editors. So I was mainly in charge of editing the third section of the SAGE Handbook on Practices and Approaches. I did that with June, but also worked with Zuba on the second section. So my reflections really have, I will try to focus more on practices, because that was actually the focus of the work I did for the handbook. And so like, I think this can maybe complement what Team Zuba and then later Ji-Woon, Marta and Maia will contribute. So in response to your questions, Gearoid, I'd like to share some ideas first about how we can use more critical decolonial approaches in teaching and researching peace and conflict. So I've identified maybe like 4 main points. First, reflexivity. I think this is something like overarching, but it's really, really important. It's really important to acknowledge how our background and experience share our vision of peace, and how this vision is embedded in a certain, in my case, I would say dominant structures and cultures. I mean, this means recognizing oppositionality, but even more than that, being reflexive at all times during all the process. I think that's really, really fundamental. And then the second point is pluralism. I think it's really key to always create space for different perspectives. That means including voices of marginalized groups, but really being open to learn from others. And it's been very powerful for me, for example, having worked with indigenous people. I have, for example, an indigenous PhD student, and I've learned so much by, listening to other perspectives. So I think this is very, very key to bear this in mind at all time, give space to a plurality of voices. Then the third point is being aware at all time of power structures, having this analysis, and this is important in teaching and researching peace and conflict, but also in all kinds of practices. And this, and always this analysis has to have a purpose, which is a commitment to greater social justice, not only just, peaceful coexistence. I mean, we need to always have this endpoint in mind of changing these structures so that they are more equitative and more plural, and enable marginalized groups to be able to participate on an equal footing. And then the fourth point related to this is encourage collaborative approaches. This is particularly relevant in research. We need to think that we are not the one having the knowledge, but we need to co-construct knowledge with our counterparts. And especially when we are outsider to a conflict setting, we really need to think that we have much to learn from people who are from this conflict setting. So obviously, there are challenges and risks in this. I think very often the tendency is to adopt a more problem-solving approach that fails to question colonial and hegemonic underpinnings of the phenomena that we study. This is especially the case when we have little time. We function like in the kind of mainstream, we follow the mainstream tendencies, and that obviously lead to the reproduction of unequal power structures and the great risk of practicing academic extractivism. So there is actually a lot of criticism in my section about, academic extractivism and recommendation about how we can avoid that. Now I want to talk very briefly about different peace practices in that section. There are authors talking about DDR, SSR, transitional justice, restorative justice, peace negotiation, community-based monitoring and evaluation. And in these discussions, there are authors actually from all around the world. And I'm also very glad that our public is also coming from very different places. And they all bring like different insights. But I want to maybe highlight 4 or 5 maybe. First, an awareness that language is not neutral, and that language conveys a dominant discourse and may disempower or exclude. For example, when we use the term victim in transitional justice, we sort of deprive these people of their agency. Also, the use of language can co-opt certain practices. We also need to be aware, as I mentioned before, with regard to teaching and researching, that all practices are permeated by different forms of power. And we need to be particularly careful about this. For example, there is a very good chapter in my section on peace negotiations and how even when there are women at the table, they may reproduce patriarchal structures. And actually what women contribute is not taken into account and doesn't have the same influence. Also foment local ownership and enable local actors to exert their agency. What also is interesting is that there are always forms of resistance and always alternatives. So it gives space to a plurality of voice and to this alternative to construct what we call a pluriversal peace. So I will stop here because I think I've passed my time, sorry, and let other co-editor and contributors contribute as well.
Thank you, Cécile. There's an important list, I suppose, with the questions so far. We'll get to after, but many of the questions, or a couple of the questions, certainly seem to be how can we achieve this, and what you're reaching for there, what you seem to be indicating there is it has to be done in many different ways, with keeping many things in mind and changing quite fundamentally the kinds of practice that's currently applied. So, hopefully we will get back to that in addressing some of the questions. Jiyun, would you like to respond to 1 or 3 of these questions?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here, and also just it was a great privilege to be on this project. And I think many of the comments will be sort of echoed here, but just to sort of focus or re-emphasize what have been mentioned. I mean, I think peace and conflict studies, we all sort of see, for those who are on this project, you know, emerging largely out of, you know, from the global north and within a particular sort of historical context, you know, reflecting the colonial history as well as the Cold War history that would frame the way that would have shaped the field, you know, predominantly, you know, basing on liberal peace theory, human rights discourse, and even sort of these rationalist approaches to conflict resolution. So I think, you know, what these efforts to decolonize the field could offer is really, and this was mentioned from previous speakers, like how could we make this field much more plural? Decolonizing the field really invites the inclusion of multiple voices that have been systematically silenced. And we're really the project was trying to broaden the theoretical horizons and help us to reimagine peace, which is not just as an absence of violence, but more of a relational harmony and including the concept of justice. And violence too is sort of conflict as well, understood as not sort of an isolated sort of episode, but rather it stretching far beyond in historical contexts. And Tim mentioned this really nicely. I think really it calls for methodological innovation of the field too, in a way that it brings back the emphasis of the lived experience of those who are being directly affected by the structural violence, and emphasize the narrative-based approach and oral histories and community-centered both scholarship and practices. rather than sort of this problem solving top-down sort of policy approaches. I think what I sort of appreciated through working on Section 4, which was on global institutions and issues, was how the authors have brought in their, how they were practicing reflexivity in their work, whether explicitly or implicitly, really pushing us as scholars, teachers, to reflect on their very positionality, and coming from the angle, like asking the question, like, who is producing this knowledge and for whom? And whatever we do, what are its implications? Being really mindful of that. I was very appreciative, as well as the process of reviewing the chapters by other peer colleagues. And this reflexivity would really bring these multiple critical approaches, whether it be feminist or post-structural approaches to peace traditions. And I would sort of echo what Zuba has shared earlier. There are, constraints and concerns emerging from these efforts as well, that we should be wary of. When we talk about decolonization, there is sort of this danger to co-opt and incorporate, as a sort of like sense of tokenism, a performative inclusivity, rather than really recentering and having these approaches genuinely sort of reflected. So in terms of like in the danger of reducing them to particular, case study or, an example of many of these approaches, I think that is a dangerous approach that we should be very cautious of. I think we are still working under many sort of limitations. Tim highlighted this nicely, the scholarship and the universities that we are in, really have this tendency to sort of start with the state-centric approach to peace and conflict studies, unless we are very mindful and be intentional of what textbooks that we choose, what readings that we choose, could convey much more diverse voices here. And in terms of the sort of the scholarship itself too, we are predominantly relying on English-speaking sort of cultures and regions, which could fundamentally sort of limit the better understanding of the other regions too. So I think, this, in particular to my section, this was highlighted really nicely in terms of like questioning the very concepts that we are using. For example, there was an excellent chapter in my section really questioning, what is global security? Asking, who is this for and at whose cost? There was, a long discussion of security focusing on like state. But in terms of when we think about the indigenous perspectives in Okinawa, the long military presence from both the US and Japan, how that really calls for much more critical feminist indigenous approach that would really bring back the voices of those who have been suffering under those presence. That really sort of shifts our understanding of what it means to provide, not provide, but what does it mean to understand security in that context? So I think, I will come back to some of these points when there are questions, but I will stop there.
Thank you. And you're really linking together a number of things there that Tim addressed and Zuba addressed and Cécile addressed. And I think we will return to these issues of the kind of the structures of the academic environment that lean into what Zuba called that kind of library and kind of restrict what is allowable really in what we do and what we think and what we eventually practice. And I'm hoping we will return to those points. Marta, sorry, when I said to everybody we have 5 of the editors, I didn't say we also have one of the authors of a chapter, or perhaps 2 chapters. Is Marta there?
Yes, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Gearoid, and thank you all for putting together this webinar, and of course to the editors to put together this handbook. I think it was very timely, and very good things have come out of it. I would like to address your third question, but I think it it interlinks with quite a lot of the things that come out and derive from your first 2 questions and that have been addressed. And with that, I have found very interesting a couple of questions that were posted by the participants. One is, how can peace and conflict enthusiastic practitioners could bring more awareness to the existing power dynamics, and actually connected to healing as the fundamental horizon. I take in my chapter not just a point about how can we decolonize peace interventions, but first of all, how do we identify that we live in the structures that the colonialism has left, and colonialism writ large in the sense of the structures of power that were set through capitalism, colonialism, modernity, and I think Suba identified very well in bringing Mudimbe here, which were rooted not just in material processes and dynamic, but also very much in ideational and epistemic structures, right? And I think one of the fundamental issues with peace building and international peace interventions is that they're founded on this binary thinking. There is a world, there exists a world which is good. There's where the good things happen in terms of a part of the world that is secure, that is democratic, that has proper political processes in place and proper processes in the sort of day-to-day aspects of political and social and economic life. And there is a part of the world that has the bad processes set up and has to be disciplined, has to be intervened, and has to be pacified, has to be secured. The thing is that, and this goes to the question of the participant, what happens with peace practitioners? I do believe that a lot of peace practitioners go through all masters and undergraduate degrees in which they are exposed to this kind of critiques. The problem is that I think they get embedded in the day-to-day practices, like I think Cécile was pointing very well. And it's hard to get out of what you need to do is what you need to do. And here is the form you have to fill in, and here is the visit you have to do. And then you get carried away with this thing. And there is no chances to actually break out from that, which is very much premised on this binary, right? That there is violence in one part of the world and there is non-violence in the other part of the world. And we don't consider that the very violence, the very structures in which conflict, armed conflict, poverty, if we want to call it underdevelopment, whatever name you want to do it, is very much rooted in the same structures that the other part of the world is standing as the model political subject, right? Where, by the way, there is also violence, and we are seeing, right? And I think it's really unavoidable, right? To bring the example of Gaza, we have seen for 2 years genocide in Gaza, but we have been seeing for the last 7 or 6 decades the conflict, the crime of apartheid and occupation, right? Michael Mann, the author of the Sources of Social Power, also wrote a book about the dark side of democracy, arguing that democracy is founded on genocide as the process in which the structures of states and democratic institutions need to make population legible, need to make population homogeneous in order to have governance. And a lot of the democracies, that we consider as model societies have also been founded on genocide through colonialism or genocide in their own territories. So what to do about it? Well, I think we have a responsibility, and I share Timothy Seidel's ideas as well, in which it's not just the list of things that we can tell peace and conflict practitioners, but it's also what kind of responsibilities we have as scholars in our day-to-day life to exactly get out of that objectivity and take the responsibility of making and engaging with practitioners so that we can start putting these issues on the agenda. Because to me as well, it's not about like I think Professor Bunch was saying, adding women and steering, right? It's not about bringing just people that have not been cited as much and just adding them to the same kind of narratives. It's about changing the narratives. Okay, I mean, that said, of course, we have to also consider that what we say, what we call the global South has been producing for, as long as colonialism has been there, producing both intellectual work, through intellectual work and through activism, many of the ideas and route maps that could perhaps take us to think differently about peace and conflict, peace interventions, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marta. You've connected a number of different things there, and I think spoken also to, again, to these bigger kind of structural problems of academia and practice and how people become kind of ingrained in these processes. They're big issues. Maia, before we get to the now various questions, 5 or 6 questions to answer, but would you like to respond or try to respond to one of these or all 3 of these?
Sure. So it's very hard to go after all of my esteemed colleagues have already covered so much of the ground and answered some of these questions so well. So I thank you again for being here this morning at all sorts of different times for all of you around the world and for my fellow panelists and for ISA. This was indeed a really exciting project to work on. It was an immense project. Each section is basically a book in itself of length. I was in charge of the case study section. And so I was looking at some of these scholars who were working on trying to weave together all of these different issues that were touched on in the other sections. And a couple of the points I just want to draw out that sort of tie into what my colleagues have already said is one, the real importance of looking at issues of structural violence and questions of origins, right? So as Marta just sort of said, when we think so much of the discussion about what's happening in Gaza today, for example, takes October 7th as the starting point. But anyone who has studied the region knows that the issues in Gaza did not start on October 7th, right? You need to look back. You need to look to what is sort of the archaeology of the conflict and the violence that is occurring there. And in many of the cases that were studied, there's a question of where do we look at for the roots of the conflict. One of the contributors to the case study section said that peace tends to legitimize the outcome of the violence that precedes it. And so I think one of the questions that emerges again and again in these questions of decolonization is a question of what is the conflict that we are studying, and how do we understand that conflict to be, and how do we understand what peace and justice and look like. Another one of the cases that is in this handbook questions the fact that in many cases of the world, negative peace for the great powers meant very extreme violence for the states that they were colonizing. And so, for example, the toxic waste from weapons testing, or the environmental damage that happens in different cases, and questioning and broadening our question of what is violence, where does it merge from, how do different parties experience this violence in different ways. And so I think to get to the point Cécile was making about our language, looking at our language, looking at our questions, I study, I've been asked recently sort of, how do you talk about what's happening between Israelis and Palestinians? Do we talk about an Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Do we talk about apartheid? Do we talk about genocide? Do we talk about occupation? What is the language that we should use to talk about what is happening? And that language may be different depending on whether we're talking about what's happening inside Israel, whether what we're talking about inside Gaza, what we're talking about inside West Bank or Jerusalem, depending on the context. But those question of language and the verbiage and the relationships of power, historical context, and for a lot of these conflicts, I think the other thing to think about in decolonizing peace studies is to think about the fact that within each case that we're studying, there's a multiplicity of actors. And we can't always, I think Gian mentioned on this too, in terms of thinking about how we tend to look at things as states. But even inside states, not all parties feel necessarily part of that state or have power in that state or recognition within that state. And so look at even how within these boundaries that we create, different actors have different positionality and different access to power, different ways that they engage in both legitimizing the system and contesting the system. So in several of the case studies, we looked at authors, looked at how in order to understand current conflicts, you need to look back not only to the colonial period or before the colonial period, but also the fact that actors themselves have agency and are contesting the colonial legacy as well as each other. And so while Fanon and others talk about how sometimes those who are occupied buy in and then reproduce those same systems, right? There are also those that are contesting them. So I think we need to look at decolonizing in a multiple manners. And yes, there's questions of history and also current context and different layers and making sure that we look at the multiplicity of voices and not taking any one voice to represent the state or the people or a group. And that's part of the decolonizing and challenging process too, is looking at the various actors that are at play and the different types of power that they use. So that's just a few little points I wanted to make, but that it's important to sort of look at both different concepts of peace and violence and the different ways actors might conceptualize the problem itself in terms of what that might be. And I will stop now so that we have plenty of time for Q&A. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you, everybody. I have been given what I now know is an absurd task of synthesizing, and I'm not sure that I can do that. I mean, I think the narrative, the responses are evidencing the complexity of this problem, right? And we have issues here of the imaginaries that are open to us and the kind of global north, liberal English dominated narrative that has really provided in some ways the foundations for the field and its limitations at the same time, and the exclusion of other voices. But even including voices, it doesn't go far enough if what we're missing is ontological breadth. And We also have issues of structure, and we have issues of limitations and what academics can achieve. We've issues, as Marta kind of articulated, of professionalization, perhaps, of young practitioners when they get into the job, and or even academics as we enter the field. And we are disciplined. That's the point, right? That's a point of a discipline, is to tell us what's appropriate and how things are done and which forms to fill in, and who to include and what to think. And even if you have a critical perspective, or you picked up a critical perspective in graduate school or some early formative stages, you drop all that aside in order to keep your career and pay the bills. I mean, there's just so many problems here that I don't know where to start, honestly. And in my own work, I'm not sure where to start. And I think we have more and more become shaped and framed as a field by the limitations of academia and restrictions in funding, and it's really creating problems for our own freedom and how much we can and cannot live up to our normative commitments, certainly in peace and conflict studies. But I'm going to, instead of trying to summarize or synthesize the conversation, I think it'd be good just to go to the questions. And there's a couple of relatively simple questions. I mean, they're short, so I'll call them simple, but they're certainly not simple to answer. And the very first one that came from Ibrahim Al-Khadamsi, who's was just the first person to post a question, but it's also the shortest one, so we'll go with it. To what extent does the handbook manage to succeed in moving beyond Western epistemologies in peace and conflict studies? So how far do you think you got? Did you think you should have done more, or do you think this is as good as we can do? Zuba's going to take that one.
I want to start by saying, when I was referring to the Colonial Library, part of the problem with that library is that it always sometimes also inscribes itself in the very attempt at trying to displace it. So it is very recursive. Now, this is not to say we don't have a way of, right? So when we were doing the handbook, there was this focus on plurality or pluralism. There was the focus on actually questioning the foundations. There were the questions, but we are still also operating within peace and conflict studies, which means that whatever it is that we produce has to be intelligible to practitioners, to scholars who engage in peace and conflict studies. So on the one hand, our job was cut for us in the sense that you're engaging with the discipline. If we completely abrogate that discipline, then what we are producing will not be intelligible for practitioners of the discipline. But on the other hand, we also realize the limitations and some of the problems that we've discussed here. So if you ask me, a decolonizationist praxis is not a one-time thing. This was one of the very first, if not the only, handbook in peace and conflict studies or that deals with these issues from a self-conscious perspective of actually wanting to do away with all of those problems. Did we succeed? To some extent. But was this supposed to be just a one-time thing? No. So we start the conversation. We brought in so many voices. We challenged the assumptions. We questioned the very discipline itself. But we can't expect that one book will do all of that. Anyway, so I think this has to be a project of permanent recommencement. And I think we have done our bit. Are there limitations? Obviously. But I think the fact that, I will end on this. I had a student come, and I like using this example because I think it clarifies what I am saying. When the first time I became a professor, I had a student walk in my office and say, "You are teaching a course that I don't need, but I am going to take it because I have never had a Black professor." So then the question is, what does the presence of a Black professor do in the classroom, even if they have a whack politics? But if you have, so what does the woman professor do in the classroom? Because we bring our experiences, we bring our histories, we bring our concerns and all of that, right? And so in this handbook, then the question is, what does the centering of those views, those perspectives that are pushed to the side, what do they do to the discipline when you have a book as central as this saying, we are attempting to decolonize peace and conflict studies. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll get to Maia's hand in a second. Cécile wanted to address this issue of the price of the book, but I think that can be rolled together with something else too, right? Like this, to me, it fits into these like the structural problems, right? One of the questions is about like for young academics who in an already precarious kind of environment, they're trying to develop their career, they're trying to get a foothold in this kind of in the field for their future. How can you be committing to something that's calling into question the whole thing? How can you be not following along with the normal practice? But this also speaks to that question of the cost, right? The practice is to produce a book, to sell the book, to get citations, but that doesn't fit with the decolonization kind of agenda or what it maybe should be to decolonize the field. There's another question there about the editors, in essence, right? That it was framed nicely. I think somewhat trying to be careful with the question, but is it fair to talk about the matter of biases in academic background, even the efforts to decolonize the field, such as this handbook's mostly written and edited by Europeans and Americans educated in mainstream universities? And is this an attempt, or is this an issue? Is this a problem when we attempt to decolonize? So a number of these questions are kind of pushing that issue of even we're trying to decolonize, but we're doing it from positions or from within institutions that are structurally set up within the within the entire power dynamic that has created the problem, right? So what can we do to get out of that? I see a lot of people agreeing and reinforcing this question.
Oh, you're making it difficult for me, Gearoid, but I'll give some reflections on this. First, about the SAGE handbook. Yeah, we also had this obviously on the top of our mind, but the good thing is that SAGE has allowed us up to 2 years to be able to do what we want with these chapters, and that means that we can publish them open access, we can translate them in different languages. So yes, will be under, behind the paywall for 2 years, but hopefully after 2 years, we can really liberate this knowledge and make it much more accessible for a very broad audience. So I think that's the good news. We know that it's not perfect. As Zuba said, this is a process. We've tried to do our best within the limitations we had, and also recognize these limitations. But the good news about the handbook is that, if you wait a little bit, these works written by a very, very broad and diverse not only in terms of nationalities, but also in terms of backgrounds, even gender identities. We have several indigenous scholars with different worldviews writing chapters. So all this knowledge will be, much more available to access after 2 years. And we have even authors who have already planned to translate it in different kinds of languages, in Thai language, for example, in Spanish, and others. About your question about early career scholars, I think it's a very, very good point. And this is really, I think, even more difficult nowadays than it was in the past. But there are also lots of good initiatives. There are journals created now in the Global South that are open access and that can give a lot of visibility to early career researchers' work. There is, by the way, an online encyclopedia of peace and conflict studies that is completely open access, that also tries to decolonize peace and conflict studies. My good friend Viviana Garcia Pinzon is one of the promoters of this encyclopedia. So if people want to produce, works that they want to be open access on this kind of topics, this is one possible avenue. This project actually, we didn't know about this project when we started the handbook, because it's been really a long process. I mean, to be able to have this publication in 2025, we had to start obviously several years before. I don't know if it was 2022 or 2023 we started with this project, but there are now some initiatives that are trying to make this much more accessible, and in particular through open access. I'll stop there because I want Maia to be able to jump in as well.
Great.
Maya.
Yeah, I just wanted to tag off of what Zuba said and bring in another quote from one of the chapters in this book, because as Zuba said, this is a process. And just this quote sort of said, decolonization, if taken seriously, is not only about inclusion and diversity, but deconstructing the whole system of entangled forms of oppression and allowing local-based, global in scope alternatives to blossom. And so it is really a starting point, right? And while we tried really hard as editors to, one, make as diverse an editing team as we could, right? We really tried to reach out then within our networks to have, reach out to find scholars from all around the world to the extent we could. And again, we couldn't, people also say no, they couldn't join or they couldn't contribute for a lot of the reasons you've noted in the chat, right? There are real constraints financially, socially, economically, politically, to these kinds of contributions. But we did, I feel pretty good about the diversity of the scope of what we achieved in this handbook and in the very short time frame that we had. But again, it is a process, and the inclusion and diversity that we have is just a step. There also needs to be sort of epistemological challenges, such as the relationship between the environment and humans that was raised in several times. So I just want to echo that, yes, we're aware of all of these very real challenges. But at the same time, we sort of need to chip away little bit by little bit. And I think those efforts are important. And I would also echo that there are a number of way more journals out there than there were when I started as a assistant professor. The Journal of Peace Building and Development sort of, which is now 20 years old, started really trying to have 50-50 representation of scholars from the global South, or however you want to frame these categories, and really made a commitment to mentoring scholars that were not in these Western institutions. And I think it's also incumbent on all of us who are on tenure and promotion committees and elsewhere to think about what are the forms of scholarship and the outlets that we want to promote and that we are recognizing, and think about these things as we push back on what institutions are telling us need to be in tenure promotion guidelines and what we want to encourage and support and recognize as valuable contributions to the field. So I just want to say that there's different ways that we can also use our positionality in our daily lives to try to change the structures of the field along some of these things. And again, there are constraints we can't necessarily all change, but I think thinking broadly about what are the ways that we can reconfigure and decolonize that aren't just in the scholarship we produce, but also the work that we do inside our institutions.
Thank you, Maya. I mean, I think that's an excellent response, really, right? I mean, things are so bad that any efforts to resolve or start resolving the challenge is better than just admitting, well, we can't do it and let's not bother. I mean, there are massive, massive challenges to be overcome in decolonizing any field, including our own. And I think this has been a really robust step forward compared to what has largely been rhetoric. So yes, still challenges to be faced, but a single step forward. Deon, you have your hands up there?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to sort of piggyback on what's been shared, and also going back to the question of like who we were as editors, because I think that was a great sort of challenge in coming into this project of being mindful that we are, located here in mostly the global North, and the authors that we were trying to bring, the earlier, the concern that I raised, this performative inclusivity, the very project that we're trying to do, we hope that it wasn't compounding the already sort of ongoing sort of silencing or not recentering genuinely of these voices. So I think we sort of really appreciated the review process of the chapters as well, because, and as Marta said, when we were, Maya said, when we were trying to invite these contributors, we had limited constraints for various reasons. Now, beyond that, we also try to really bring much more of these diverse voices as we asked for peer reviews, so that it could be better addressed So in a way, I think it should be sort of, like Zuba mentioned, we were not trying to say that this is an exhaustive and complete sort of project. It was more of commencing that this could be one of the many efforts that we try to attempt here for the field. And when, as a junior scholar, you know, having to juggle these realistic sort of institutional constraints and, you know, getting your article published, or having the work be read, you know, when we are dealing with this fundamental sort of challenge of what is considered to be legitimate knowledge, I find great sort of sense of relief in, you know, finding communities and solidarity of those of like-minded people. So, you know, perhaps associating more and really connecting with those very, you know, people who would like to share those goals. I think that is one way to, one way to be not so feeling powerless or being disempowered in terms of continuing the work that we're trying to do.
Can I thank you, Gian. Can I, to return to the questions? So there's one that here that's a bit more, I think, complicated, but complex, difficult, but it also, I think, captures other elements or problems, right? And this was Henri's, the very first start of his, there's a longer question, but the biggest doubt, he said, is how to avoid the absorption of decolonial thought by neoliberalism, right? And I think this connects to a longer trajectory of neoliberalism and power generally absorbing critical or revolutionary or initial ideas that attempt to overthrow the power or attempts to chip away at the power, and it just kind of absorbs them, consumes them, right? In the way the kind of 1968 revolution became just something more to be consumed and bought by Gen X and Gen Z, right? It has this power to just absorb what should be trying to change it. Is there a threat, or is there a worry that the same happens with the decolonial move, or the move towards decolonialism in our field, that it is something that becomes niche, cool, and therefore might get clicks and citations, and so people go to it, but really just for the same traditional consumerist academic incentives of, if I write in this, I'll get some citations. I am honestly worried that when things become a buzzword, they become part of the system as opposed to chipping away at the system.
And that exactly is the caution that I was trying to sound, actually. I just finished writing a book, and the 5th chapter is like a searing critique of decolonization because of the symbolic gesture that it has become and the ornamental, what Sylvia Kisakankwe, Rivera Kisakankwe calls strategic corruption and ornamental, right? And so it becomes at this point, but the issue is that, so it does, let's say you meet a roadblock, does it then mean that you're just going to leave your car and walk because there's a roadblock? Or do you improvise? That's when actually your creativity comes in, right? And so the issue here then is that if we are seeking to decolonize, I am very critical of especially those who just flag the decolonial aspect. Actually, I'm in fight with my publisher right now because they want me to title my book Decolonizing African Studies. And I was like, but that's not what I am doing. The book is Thinking the Colonial Library. And they are telling me to retitle this Decolonizing because that is what will sell, that is what will sell the book. But I'm like, I'm not gonna do that. I don't play that kind of game. So the issue here for a handbook like this, part of the reason why we didn't even say this is decolonizing peace and conflict studies is precisely because we are aware of that. That's one. But the second thing is just because, and the strategic corruption is real. Actually, Alain Badiou has this idea that neoliberalism actually proliferates through targeting sites of difference, right? So, oh, like, well, let's start selling halal meat because we know Muslim consumers are there. It's not like you care for them. It's just that, you know, if you start selling halal meat, then people will come. Oh, let's sell kosher. So even the site that which is seen as oppositional becomes the site where neoliberal extraction takes place. And it co-opts the language and it becomes part of this general, like in Canada, the government will talk about decolonize, but when indigenous issues come, we still have indigenous reserves where there is no clean drinking water. We still have the issue of the murdered and missing indigenous women. We have all of these problems, right? So we understand that. But again, like I said, if you meet a roadblock, will you park your car and walk? Or do you try to navigate that roadblock? And I think part of what this project has initiated is realizing that a decolonization is praxis. One, it's not a one-off thing. It's not symbolic, and we are calling attention to that. And even when we, and I'll end on this, even when we contacted people who are based in the Global South or people that we thought would be good for the project that were not available, like Cécile especially was like really, really keen on this. Even for this conversation that we are having, her primary concern was like, we can't just, like, we need voices that are outside. Unfortunately, people are busy and stuff. But the point is that point of the plurality of voices, because the plurality of voices also means plurality of experiences, the centering of plurality of experiences. And that chips away at some of the mainstream narratives that we have. But even when, for instance, some of our authors, initially, like the first drafts that were produced, were not up to what we were expecting, we never dropped anyone. We went back to them and said, after the peer review, but also the editorial intervention, and say, can you do it this way? Take into consideration this, because this is what we are aiming at. And so that also, even like people are talking about junior scholars and stuff, that also became also a mentorship project where some people are like, well, you know, you could write, you write, and then we're like, we're not going to tell you what you're writing is not okay, but this is the vision that we have. Can you edit it and revise it this way? I know there is a chapter that we got the author to revise like 4 times. It came out fantastic, but nobody knows the kind of work that goes with it. And it's also part of a decolonial ethics for you not to just drop someone because they didn't meet your expectations. But how do you bring them to what you envision and what you think the entire project is about? So those are some of the things that we do. Neoliberalism is always going to be there. It's always trying to steal, to appropriate. But this is why we also need to be stating the strategic interventions in order to be able to call that into question and in order to forestall it. Do we completely get out of it? I am not sure. Our entire economic system is that. But can we push against it? Obviously.
Okay. I mean, this seems to, so there's a question there from Fode Jallo, building on Ibrahim's question. No, sorry. What could be done better to move beyond what you did in the handbook to decolonize peace and conflict studies? And it seems that Zuba's pushing that there, right? Like, and we've mentioned this is the first step. This was opening the door, maybe. This is the first thing to happen. But Cécile or June, Maia, does anybody want to say, well, what would be the next step then? So to push this beyond this volume, where would you suggest yourselves or others should, you know, if you're going to pick it up, where should they be? What should they be trying to do next?
I mean, I think there's a lot of work to do. I mean, I think I fully echo what Zuba just said, that I think we need to think about this as an ongoing process, just like people didn't submit an article and it was one and done. It was a back and forth. It was a conversation. It was a dialogue. It was this person can't do it, so how can we find somebody else? There's a lot of heavy work trying to find, get voices to the table, right? And then make sure that those voices could be heard at the table. So we need to really think beyond the neoliberal add people and stir approach, which was referenced earlier, and that is an old concept. But I think it's also a matter, I think this ties into the question about Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And I have 3 kids who are in these various generations, and we're teaching these people. And there's this tendency, I think, in some cases, to want things to be easy and to just grab the headline from TikTok or grab the quick 10-minute snippet. And I think part of this decolonizing process, it's long and tough and tedious, and requires a lot of work and chipping away again in these, looking not just at the big picture, which can be overwhelming, but also think about the issues in our day-to-day practice and our day-to-day life, and thinking about our hiring process and our committee processes and our institutional processes and the different ways we can push when we're also facing walls everywhere we go. So I like Zuba's metaphor of the roadblock. So we have the roadblock. What do we do? How do we get around it? Our administration says we can no longer have DEI mentioned anywhere on our websites. So what do we do to promote those concepts when we're told we can't, right? So we need to think creatively, and we need to sort of not give up when we're told no, or say, when we get the critical feedback, say, okay, yes, how can I improve? What can I change? Take this as a mentoring opportunity, and so I think part of it is just revising our mindsets, and thinking also about that this is a long haul, and that we need to sort of find ways to find fortitude and support and solidarity with each other as we engage in this long process work.
Thank you. Cécile, see your hand is up.
Yes, I think my colleague and Zuba said it very well, so I completely agree with them. But I wanted to just mention something else that was related to some comment in the chat. We are also trying to actually diversify the places where we can have these conversations. And in the peace study sections, I want to say that for the first time, we will have actually a conference outside of North America, outside of the US and Canada, so to speak. So, this is maybe just a start, but we hope that in the future, similar conferences can be held elsewhere and in partnership with local organizations that are interested in discussing these topics. So that will make it also much more, we are completely aware in the peace study section, we had this discussion. I'm part of the executive committee about people, for example, from the Philippines. It's really expensive to go to the US. And right now, with all the visa and the migration restrictive migration policy, it's really difficult for people from the global south. So it's like different issues that make it very difficult for people who are in these universities to participate in the conversation. So we are trying to actually move to other areas of the world to have these conversations in other settings. And I think this is a start, this is a process, but this is really good that these things are happening, and let's hope that in the future there will be more and more projects like this one, conferences in different places, conversations, publications, coming from different parts of the world.
Thank you. Oh, June, go ahead.
I would just quickly add that, along with diversifying these places where these conversations take place, just looking back, the overall project of this editing, the process of editing this project was, I remember the very first couple of meetings that we had, we were really, we were limited by the page number of the volume, which systematically enforced us to sort of limit the very topics that we really wanted to include. So, the next step that I hope to see is, I think, was it Zuba who mentioned earlier, like each of the section merited perhaps a book of its own, and we could pretty much expand in all of these sections. So, I'm just that memory of us really trying to figure out what to be included as a chapter, because we left out many, many things. I think that really highlights the need to have this much more broadened, and what to come in the future.
It does, so we're almost finished, but I've been thinking the whole time about the these structures and issues of privilege and you know, one of the things that seems to require us to publish in certain ways, publish with certain publishers, publish in certain journals is that there's prestige in those things, and therefore there's a career in those things, you get citations in those things. And senior academics, you know, very senior academics, we all probably personally know 2 or 3 or 4 of these people who are massive names in the field who could get more leverage with publishers, who could bring more eyes to this kind of work, who could use their profile and their influence, getting grants or publishing, to better open the door to allow more flexibility to where you should publish. Do you feel collectively, individually, do you feel that leaders in the field in peace and conflict studies, and we all know who those people are, do you think that they have done enough to open the door for decolonized approaches? I often personally feel not. That this is being left to junior scholars to try to figure out against all of these headwinds, when if senior academics were more involved, they could open some of those doors easily. So I'm just wondering, do you feel that kind of there could have been more done, or there could still yet be more done if leaders in the field were willing to step in?
I think this is a great point. I think it also then begs the question of, does that then open up to this neoliberal taking over of the field? So I think there's pros and cons there, right? If they, what exactly are they pushing, and for what reasons? So I think, yes, I think it's good for leaders, thought leaders, to push the envelope, but it might be that they're better positioned to make institutional change and push the boundaries of what is acceptable, outlets for publication, what do we count as viable knowledge, and rather than just looking for citations, maybe there's other ways that we validate and what other things that we value in terms of scholarly production, outlets, contributions, and maybe that's the better place for them to push. I don't know.
Yeah. But
what are we doing also when we try to center these big name academics as well? Part of a decolonizationist praxis is also to actually try and dismantle this idea that there is a particular form of hierarchy that exists. And if you publish, like in my whole intellectual career, I have never been pressured by that. I publish where I want to, when I want to. Fortunately, my previous university allowed that. Right. So the issue here is that when we hold people in these pedestals, and sometimes, actually, I like going to graduate student and junior academic conferences, because sometimes the best ideas come from there. People, if you have become a big name, sometimes they just reproduce the same ideas for the past 20 years. There is nothing new except new sight. Again, I'm not casting aspersions on anyone. And I think the issue here then is for us to bring our own sensibilities to the classroom. And Maia was referring, for instance, to her children. But even the classroom, when you teach, what are you teaching? How do you frame your courses? What are the epistemic, the ethical, the pedagogical considerations that are informing your scholarship? And as we do that, right, like you chip away at the foundations. And when I design courses, I actually look for people who are saying interesting things, but that may not be known, and introduce them to my students. And I think that is important. So the issue here is now, yes, they could do it, but actually most of the people who become big name academics, most of the time, I'm not saying all of them, but many of them are careerists. They believe in the project, or if they are speaking critical language, sometimes it is perfunctory, because that is what will get them to where, and once they get to that point, that politics is never going to change. So I think the question should not be, or the onus and the pressure should not be on us. For instance, when we were doing this, I don't know if it's Magenti, he was like, I want to be involved with this project, but I have this chapter, I don't know how it fits. And we're like, well, we will try to make it fit. The point that, so there are people like that who are really interested in how do we move forward, these kinds of like really radical conversation that we want, or the visions that we have for the disciplines. And there are those And the ultimate is big if you write. So people like that also have a responsibility, like you did with the handbook. But I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, let's just go, oh, let's go to Gearoid because he's a big name scholar. What is your ethics? What is driving your scholarship? What is the motivation behind it? And I think that also is really important, right? Like Maya would say. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Zuba. I think we're scheduled to go to 3 p.m. my time. I believe many of you are earlier in the morning, but I guess we're out of time. We haven't addressed all of the questions that were posted, but we have addressed many of them, and I think the conversation in various ways touches on a lot of them. So I thank everyone for participating, for attending. Obviously, 130, 140 people at some point, so thank you very much. The recording will be made, I believe, available to everybody who registered for the event, so that will come to you. And of course, thank you for the 6 participants, some of whom had to run and teach. But for those of you left, thank you very much for taking this time and a very interesting conversation. And as I think you've all kind of stressed, the first step on what is probably a very, very long and arduous process, but definitely one that's worth that trip that's worth taking, I suppose. So thank you very much.